What's up? I am David Long. Glad to be back here on the Integral stage with y'all. Big thanks to Bruce Alderman for inviting me back. So today I want to talk about integral religion, the future of integral religion. Now, if you saw one of my last talks on the integral stage, we did integral religion and spirituality about sacred naturalism. But that talk was more from a personal perspective, like how to have a personal, integral, religious and spiritual practice, a life practice. So today's talk is going to be about the future of religion, the future of spirituality, the future faces of spirit, if you want to be poetic. So that last talk is more from a personal upper quadrant kind of perspective, and this talk is going to be more from a futuristic, integral culture lower quadrant kind of perspective. Like, what are the traditions and values and the systems and methods for creating a holistic, integral tradition of the future? Just like in the last video, the thing that's going to be similar is the approach to religion and tradition and mythology and spirituality. It's not going to be like the buffet style, new agey, like pick and choose what you like kind of thing. And it's also not going to be this kind of far-sighted mish-mashing where you take everything that looks kind of similar and ultimately really reduce it down to the way that you see it, trying to collapse all the mountaintops into the mountaintop that you like. These are the early, personal, post-formal versions of integration. It starts off with early vision logic, then mid-vision logic, and there's also a late-stage vision logic. And I'm going to talk about the movements through these developmental stages and how they relate to each other. These are kind of the two forms of unskillful integration that we want to separate ourselves from. We want to integrate diversity with discernment. We want to take a big picture view. We want to do a meta-analysis of all the religious traditions, favoring none, looking for the universal themes and how they appear in the different personal and cultural costumes of different cultures. We want to really understand what the universal approach to religion is like. And thankfully, this work has mostly already been done for us by people like Joseph Campbell, who have really demonstrated how this is done better than anyone else that I can think of.
Miss you, Joseph Campbell.
Follow your bliss and don't be afraid. And doors will open where you didn't know they were going to be.
Okay. I see we got some heaven here. Some reincarnation. That looks nice. I like this, the look of this aura chakra combination. That's pretty good. What is that? Crystals? Yeah, okay. Astrology, not so much for me. I'm more of an Enneagram person. Oh, you know what would really decalcify my pineal gland right now, really lube my third eye? I really need to find some of that Merkaba, some of that sacred geometry, some of that flower of life stuff. Maybe I can figure out the secret, can manifest that somehow in this buffet. Are we fresh out of the quantum physics and the channeling and the psychics and the astral projection? We don't want this buffet style approach to religion. I might fill up on the UFOs though if we don't hurry. The problem is it's incoherent, it's inconsistent with itself, it's self-contradictory, it's a bad integration of religion, it's out of touch with reality, it doesn't even make sense. So if it wasn't a bad integration, if it wasn't inconsistent with itself, and if it wasn't out of touch with reality, it wouldn't be such a big problem. It makes sense that after you first deconstructed your worldview, be it traditional or modern or both, that the cutting edge for you would be to take into account all these new perspectives. For the first time, you're really free and you're able to explore all of these new traditions and really sample to know what is good and true about each one of them. And if you're really starting to see, wow, there's good stuff in all these things, this is the beginning of healthy integration. So I'm not just saying that it's a problem to be here or it's a problem to be there, but realize that it's not the end. It's not the final stage. There's a higher stage of integration yet. Don't get stuck. These are just the extreme ways that it goes wrong. It doesn't have to go wrong in these kinds of ways. Often people move through these stages and don't go to these extremes. For example, people who are raised in more traditional families who take the time to really deconstruct those traditions and learn about rationality might not be so quick to try and collapse everything down at the buffet. They can be in the buffet with their sword in hand, sampling things, learning about the pros and cons, and then maybe making their way to some kind of a healthy and skillful integration without getting caught in the clusterfuck or the conflation. So that's totally possible. These are just the potential extreme problems that we see with integration. And it makes sense that after a while of sampling all these traditions that we'd figure out some way of starting to synthesize these ideas and to figure out how they all might fit together. And we might end up emphasizing one system more than the other, or really leaning into that and still kind of including a couple of the other things, but how it mostly harmonizes with that one system. And that's not really great integration either. It leads to a type of conflation and mishmashing, and it can lead to favoring certain unexamined biases without even really realizing it. And a lot of times people do this because they aren't really in touch with truth, because their epistemology isn't good. They end up over-favoring, let's say, the upper left quadrant and personal experience, some of the least reliable methods of knowing, and ignoring what a lot of science and things have to say, and trying to reduce it to orange as if science only has value if you're at a rational materialistic stage or something. So again, an unhealthy integration, over-glorifying one system, not really in touch with reality and what's actually true. Like, for example, someone like Jordan Peterson is like a very poor man's Joseph Campbell, who can kind of do some of the trans-rational interpretations of religious symbolism, but seem to kind of ultimately want to collapse it down into like a Christian mountaintop. Like, it's really kind of all about God and Christianity or whatever. Like, maybe he'll kind of appeal to mystery, but, he's a Christian. Another great example of conflation, ancient aliens. Oh, the Bible? Aliens. These ruins we found? Aliens. Everything comes back to aliens. And we see other people doing this too in the integral spaces. Like Steve McIntosh basically does that same thing where he's like, oh, we're integral. We all agree about integral, but really it's about God. And I want to make room for this belief in a personal God and call that integral.
And at the heart or the depth of this realm is the spiritual experience of the love of the Creator for each creature. The love of God, the thrilling experience of being known and cared for as an individual by the source of the universe, is a thrilling confirmation of the faith of those who have a personal relationship with God, this creative being, which has will and love.
This creator God sees me, Jeff, and loves me, Jeff.
That's what the experience of the love of God confirms.
And it happens with Buddhism too. You have people like Ken Wilber or Andrew Cohen or some of these other people who have appeared in our integral spaces who are kind of familiar with all of the distinctions and the traditions, but really it's about Buddhism. Let me give an example. Some of you have seen this book, The Religion of Tomorrow. This is my example of the type of bad integration that I'm talking about. This book is about what a possible religion of tomorrow might look like. So first of all, he's not saying this is what the future of integral religion is. This is not an integral religion of tomorrow. This is a possible religion of tomorrow might look like. It's meant to apply across the field of the great traditions. I believe that all of them will, in fact, most likely end up incorporating many of these elements into their own fundamental teachings at some point, simply because the forces driving towards such are so varied and far-reaching and on balance, indeed make such a great deal of sense. Nonetheless, in this particular presentation, I have chosen one religion, that of Buddhism, of course, to use as a concrete instance, because specifics need to be given as actual examples of what is directly involved, and that requires a religion to use as an example. I'm not suggesting that Buddhism is somehow superior or more advanced, and thus more open to this. In fact, as one example, there are already a dozen books in print using the exact framework I will be introducing here to create similarly futuristic Christianity. So there's no particular bias involved here. I believe any of the great traditions could be used as an example, and versions of many of them, including Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Judaism, as well as Buddhism, have already been presenting following the same suggestions in this book to show what would be involved in their own cases. So here's my problem with this. We're not creating an integrative, holistic, transformative, integral religion of the future with this book. With this book and several of the other books that he's talking about, those are integrally informed hacks of these old traditions. Like, you can be a Christian, but be an integral Christian. You can be a Buddhist or be an integral Buddhist. There's some major problems with that. For example, if you ultimately reduce everything back to one symbol set, Buddhism, Christianity, then you kind of end up over-glorifying one symbol set or one way of talking about things, and it ends up clouding your perspective. And you become kind of the ultimate nerd for one symbol set. Like, imagine if you were talking to a person who constantly brought everything back to Star Wars, like, oh, the Force and Jedis and the dark side and all this kind of stuff. You'd be like, yeah, okay, but that's just one way of talking about things. And it only emphasizes some particular things, and it leaves out other important things. And then you end up reducing everything back to the mountaintop that you know about, that you prefer. Oh, this reminds me of Buddhism. This reminds me of Christianity. And then you ultimately still do end up favoring one worldview, which is not integral.
Nobody with any intelligence says that the religions are exactly the same. I mean, clearly Muslims go on the Hajj to Mecca and Christians don't go on the Hajj to Mecca, and Muslims don't follow the 7 sacraments of Catholicism, nor do they follow the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. So clearly there are differences across religions, and that isn't the question. The question is whether those differences matter, whether those differences are, as many say, inessential or inconsequential. And I frankly think it's condescending to say, oh, well, the Hajj doesn't really matter. Tell a Muslim that. Like, how can it not matter? It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, or the 5 prayers a day that Muslims insist on, also as part of the 5 pillars of Islam. What's inconsequential or inessential about that? What always happens when people want to push the great religions into one box, into one mountaintop, right, rather than many mountaintops, is you come up with your own ad hoc idea of what the mountaintop is, right? Oops, it just happens to be my vision of what religion should be, right? So maybe there's one God who maybe sounds and talks and walks a lot like Jesus. Or, maybe it's the mystical experience, which just happens to be the piece of religion that you value. Or maybe it's compassion, which just happens to be your particular preoccupation with what the religion should be doing. But in any case, it's you. If basically Taoism is essentially the same as Christianity, well, what is there to learn from studying Taoism? What's the difference between a Taoist in China and a Christian here in Washington, D.C.? And I want to be able to hear what the Confucians say, what the Taoists say, what the Buddhists say, what the Jews say about what religion is. And that's what I try to do.
If you watch my previous video that I mentioned in the beginning, if you were really coming at this stuff from an integral perspective, you would be integrating multiple symbol sets, multiple ways of talking about things, not just for your own ability to see past your local symbol set and to be able to see a thing from several different perspectives through several different lenses instead of only having one way that you always talk about and think about things. But also it's important, if you're an integral practitioner, to be able to engage with other people in their traditions, and that means speaking to them in their language and their symbol set, which means understanding that and not just reducing everything back to what Christianity has to say about things. So this is a major problem. This is a major pitfall that a lot of integralists fall into, including Ken Wilber. So also the problem here is with which traditions Wilber is counting as the great traditions. How would you decide which traditions were the great traditions? And what's with the ones that you're leaving out? Do they not bring things to the table? Are they not great enough to be considered or counted in our perspective on religion? What you actually find out is that this is an incredibly biased integration. The problem here is that he ends up only counting the traditions that harmonize with his pre-assumed worldview, which comes from Eastern traditions. So he only counts the idealistic traditions. He doesn't include other spiritual traditions like paganism or any of the early nature traditions, only Eastern and Western idealistic traditions. Also, there's a very bad and unhealthy relationship with science. So there is a really bad negative bias rooted in Wilber's integration. Let's look at what it says here in chapter 17, Integral Semantics and New God Talk. I have pointed out on several occasions that the coming world, having gone from God everywhere to God nowhere, is now slowly entering God everywhere again. But the God that is everywhere is a different God indeed, at the opposite end of the spectrum of development from the original God, and possessing few, if any, similar characteristics. This demands an entirely new language of God talk. a completely new way to communicate about these ever-present, all-pervading realities, and totally different versions of sight and symbols representing these widely new, astonishing, shocking realities. Notice where he's talking about how we're shifting from God everywhere to God nowhere, back to God everywhere again. But there's a difference in the characteristics of God. Here's the thing, though. It's not just a difference in the characteristics of God. Again, this is where you have people like Steve McIntosh over here collapsing everything back into his Christian mountain, which he prefers. Talking about, well, we can believe in God again because it's not that mean, judgy God of the Bible. This is really an all-loving God as a reality. It's not mean, so now we can still believe in it again.
I mean, of God, as I understand it, from a pantheistic conception, not a mythic judge, but a source of reality which can love and be loved.
It's like that's not how you justify a belief in God. And that's not the transition that we're talking about. And I'm sorry if I sound disrespectful. I'm just trying to keep it real with you. A lot of these leaders, I think, are actually misleaders. To me, if you put yourself in the position of a teacher or a leader, you better have intellectual honesty, or you're going to really have a hard time earning my respect. And yeah, actually, if you come into integral spaces and you try and convince people that you can just believe in God or be a Buddhist, and that's integral, to me, you're not really helping. You're not really that good of a leader, and you're not going to have a lot of my respect. Even if you're also doing good things, which a lot of these people are saying and doing good things. But it can't just be as easy as people say the words transcend and include and talk about integral and the spiral, and we just give them a pass for everything that they say and do. It's not going to work like that. We need to be able to make distinctions about the right and wrong ways to do integral in the world. Super important. And we need to have discussions about these things. So meet me in the comments section. Let's argue it out. So Wilber here, his way of framing going from God as everything to no God anywhere to a new concept of God at the other end of development. He's basically saying that we've gone from this Western idea of God everywhere to no God to this new understanding that spirit is underlying everything. We know what Wilber's ideas are about tetra arising and all this stuff. It's Buddhism, rooted in a Hindu dogmatic creation myth. He takes that dogmatic creation myth literally, and it's embodied in his ideas about tetra arising and consciousness going all the way down and back, even though that's not really what science seems to be telling us. So he seems to be, again, ignoring a lot of the scientific data and the more reasonable emergentist perspectives that most scientists seem to agree with, and he reduces them to orange materialists when most of them are not. And he reduces religion to the great traditions because it's easier for him to act like at the end of the day they're all talking about Buddhism and his worldview. Whereas things like paganism and some of these other traditions can't be so easily conflated into Buddhism. Look at this chart where he's got this circle of the great traditions, right? And he's comparing the inner and outer reality. Look what he does. Just like I'm saying, he's conflating them. For Christianity, you have Godhead, and then over here you have Brahman. Christianity is this creator of the world from the outside, and Buddhism has God on the inside becoming the world. These are completely different concepts of what God is, and yet he's saying, oh look, they're all saying the same thing, but they're not. He's acting like they're all saying the same thing, and then reducing it all back down to his worldview, like they're all justifying his worldview. Again, this is an unhealthy bias integration. Wilber says that he doesn't have a bias towards a particular symbol set, and maybe he doesn't. But his bias does seem to be about cashing these ideas out in accord with his bias understanding of reality rooted in a literal translation of Eastern creation myths, which is a pre-trans fallacy number 2, as I've said. And so even though he acts like he's cool with all of these different languages, he's doing just like these ancient aliens, including all of these different things, but ultimately conflating it into his pre-assumed worldview. And that's bad integration. We can't just all assume, oh yeah, they're all saying the same thing, and so it's totally cool for me to just keep talking about my understanding of God and assuming that, yeah, the rest of the religions, they just agree. Yeah, that's bad integration. Religions are different. Different religions emphasize different things. Different religions are coming from different biased perspectives, and that needs to be taken into account. They're not all the same. They're not all doing the same thing or doing the same thing equally well. For example, Buddhism is really good at state training and being here now. and transcending the self. And paganism and magic is really good at self-creation and becoming and creating the self. These are not the same tradition. They have almost opposite inflections, and they shouldn't be conflated into each other. We should understand the pros and cons of each. We should understand that Buddhism is great at being here now, but it also has a problem with spiritual bypassing, which Wilber has a problem with too.
It would seem that it doesn't really matter whether we continue to have a role in this play.
In this play?
The humans.
Sure.
Why should we care?
Ooh. Yeah, good one. Good one. So of course you want to work to alleviate suffering. And you want to work to alleviate hunger. But on the absolute side, the analogy is if you're in a dream at night and there are thousands of people starving, there are two ways you can stop their hunger. One is in the dream you can try to feed them all. But the second is you can wake up. And that will end their suffering immediately.
And the magical self-creation stuff is really good as well, but if it's not being done from a perspective beyond ego, then it just becomes selfish and immature and short-sighted. So you need both, but exclusively neither. You need a hybrid. We need the integration of multiple of these traditions to actually skillfully activate all the functions really well and show you what all of these traditions bring to the table. And this, again, goes back to the last talk I did here on the Integral stage about that topic. Link in the description. So, there are these universal ideas about unity and duality that appear in every single tradition. But those concepts of unity and duality are going to be different. And we can't just favor the ones that we like. We have to see through the costumes to the truth. If you're really coming from an integral perspective, you can make a distinction between a literal belief in God as this second person out there somewhere, to then, yes, believing that none of those old religious ideas are true, to then re-including those old ideas in a poetic framework. Like there's something of value to be found in these texts, in these ideas, but you have to be able to read the ideas in context. There are different concepts of God from different perspectives. Like Wilber mentioned Godhead in the Christian tradition versus Brahman or Vishnu or something like this in the Eastern traditions. These are different concepts. And the question is, how do they cash out? Oh God, that means ultimate reality. It's a poetic way of talking about the mystery of reality. And that could be interpreted in a emergentist type cosmology. On the other hand, you might get some kind of panpsychic, dualistic, idealistic translation of God. These symbols can cash out in different ways depending on which metaphor you favor. And the metaphor that we favor should be supported with cross-quadrant validation, with explanatory power from what seems to be true from an integral epistemology that takes into account all four quadrants and understands them skillfully in relationship to each other. Not an approach that favors the upper left quadrant and demonizes science and scientists, the knowledge from the exterior quadrants, to favor what you personally like. So a healthy integral methodology is really important and really matters. I made a video going into depth about the way that Wilber goes wrong in terms of his integration. It's called What You Talking About, Wilber? I Amness Before the Big Bang. Link in the description. It talks about how he looks in the wrong quadrant for data, how it's a pre-trans fallacy number two, taking a traditional dogmatic religious tradition literally, and he's qualifying the unqualifiable, making claims about the absolute beyond anyone's ability to know, majorly overstepping his bounds. He's breaking his own rules in at least 3 different ways. So you can check that video out. I'm going to continue on. So I feel like I'm always talking about the pre-trans fallacy. I've done a ton of videos on it. Highly suggest you check them out. I also recently did a video here on the Integral stage with Layman on the topic. What's up, Layman? Big respect, my friend. Hope you're doing well. So you should check those videos out. Link in the description. The pre-trans fallacy is a super important distinction that I think everybody in our community should be able to make. These pre-trans distinctions and the understanding that there are going to be different translations of experience from different levels of development, and knowing how to understand these symbols in their historical and cultural context, as well as a contemporary cultural and personal, how does this apply to me in my life, and maybe a more general universal interpretation of archetypes and symbolism, and to be able to look at all of these levels and not conflate them and understand how to do that skillfully. Understanding ideas in an unfolding context is super important to skillful integration. So I spoke about important functions that religions play, and Joseph Campbell says that there's 4 main functions. The first function we might put in the upper left is the mystical function, which opens up the mystery of reality, which is also your mystery. Getting in touch with mystery, it opens up awe of the wonder of the universe. And notice the important key word here is mystery. Even modernity has tried to incorporate a lot of these elements. There's a really good talk where Neil deGrasse Tyson basically describes his relationship with science as a type of mystery tradition.
I became a student of the universe with the ambition of one day being one of its participants in research on the frontier of cosmic discovery. And that ambition, that inculcation, stayed with me the whole time. To the point where when you become an astrophysicist, when you become a scientist at all, you would go on pilgrimages to mountaintops because that's where your telescopes are. And so that's part of the pilgrimage. There's the effort of the travel, and then there's the effort of flipping your schedule and going nocturnal. Then there's the telescope itself, this conduit to the cosmos. It's a tube. It's a conduit. And I sit there and I reflect on it. My specialty was the center of the Milky Way galaxy, 30,000 light years away. And so I have my digital detectors, I've got the telescope, it's dark, it's just me on this mountain and the universe. And I look up and I just think to myself, there are photons that have been traveling for 30,000 years. And I'm sort of snatching them from this journey and planting them into my digital detector. So there's not only the fact that I'm on the mountaintop, there's the knowledge and the feeling that I'm reaching out to the universe with these methods and tools of science.
So my point is, there's a lot of different ways to get in touch with the mystery of reality. There's a lot of different traditions and approaches to ultimate mystery. And it's important to include that factor without trying to collapse it into some kind of ultimate symbol. Honestly, I think this is where traditions like Islam really shine, where they don't want to collapse Allah into a particular symbol. It can't be pictured. God as a mystery is an important thing. And of course, I think it's important that we have ceremonies and rituals, that we get together, that we sing together, that we can figure out ways to upgrade the best parts of religion that really have worked throughout time to make room for these different rituals of renewal and rededication, to create communion, to build community. And I think there's a difference between teaching and preaching. I think preaching is something much more like encouraging people. We're using archetypes from the story of the seeker or the hero who's on his adventure, and different references to different stories, like use the sword. These are different examples of different stories where the seeker uses the sword or fails to use the sword and gets tempted and goes astray.
The wizard!
The person preaching or giving the sermon or giving the lesson can be encouraging the individual and empowering them to go back out into the world and to stay focused on this higher path of dedication to this higher purpose. This relates to the second function Joseph Campbell is talking about, called the cosmological function, which means it has to serve this time in history and include its issues and its problems. And if the mythology is out of date, that can be a major problem, because now the stories aren't relevant to the time and the virtues of the past become the vices of the future. What was good 2,000 years ago is not necessarily good today. And so it's important that our symbols and our metaphors be in line or cash out with our current life today. And so there are some things that are more and less relevant. For example, in many ethnic traditions like Judaism or Hinduism, you have these sexist and racist versions of God. And it's good to understand those things in their cultural and historical contexts, but it's not good to advocate for those ideas now. So there are definitely going to be things that are not appropriate for the time that we live in. Things that are racist or sexist or homophobic or any of these kinds of things. Some stories are definitely better left in the past. So when you see the word cosmology, you might be thinking like origin stories. And that's definitely a part of it. Actually, one of the reasons why we don't have an up-to-date, healthy version of religion is because our cosmology, our understanding of the universe, has changed and changed and changed, and religions just haven't been able to keep up with it. But we are actually now at a point in history where we do have a somewhat consistent and firm cosmology starting to crystallize that we can rely on pretty well. And so it makes sense that we would be able to build a religion that will last for a little while, especially if we make one that's open to refinement and upgrades along the way. The third function is the sociological function, which binds together a group with roles and rules. So that's going to depend on what the society is like and what's good in that culture and how we want to set those things up. We'll need to figure that stuff out. And there's also this fourth function of the pedagogical function, which has to do more with like structures and moving the individual through the inevitable stages and crises of life: births, weddings, initiations, funerals, all the things that you have to deal with in growing up and moving through stages. So when it comes to this pedagogical function, we really have to figure out what's our philosophy around things like births and deaths, and how do we as a society want to handle that and guide people through those processes. Also, we need initiation rituals, especially for men, into adulthood. And the reason especially for men is because women's initiation into adulthood, into being a woman, comes more through nature. And traditionally, men are initiated by other men into adulthood. And so we probably need some things like that as well. These are some of the things that we need to consider. So there are a lot of details to work out. So we as a society would have to think of new rituals and new ways of organizing and structuring. That could be everything down from like the look of new churches or cathedrals or whatever you want to call it, however you want to make that look, to like calendars and the ways that we think about time and relate to the universe in that kind of a way. Actually, throughout history, a lot of religions, when they took hold, have changed the calendar. For example, right now, this is 2020 AD. You know, maybe if we had a future integral religion, we would restart the calendar and come up with new ways of talking about how we relate to time. Actually, lots of societies, for example, align themselves with the sun. That's kind of interesting. Maybe we could go back to some of that. I like that. These cultures seem to be a lot more in touch with nature. That might be a good kind of way to orient us back. Interesting things to think about. But again, you know, it's early days with some of this stuff, and a lot of these things still need to be fleshed out. But these are the different functions of a religion of the future that we would need to take into account to really have a holistic expression. We know that it has to do all these things. And we also know about the pitfalls in each of these quadrants. In the upper left quadrant, we want to keep it open to mystery. In the upper right quadrant, we need to keep it relevant to the time we live in. In the lower left quadrant, it also needs to be relevant to the time that we live in, so that way the roles and the rules are in touch with what's actually going on in the world. And in the lower right, we need to really understand how the average life can flow and create an optimized system to hold together a society in the most healthy and optimized way. Religion is going to be a big part of the project of having a healthy society. If you think back to what you know about spiral dynamics, you'll probably remember that it was actually at the blue stage of development that really we were able to start to hold together cultures on a mass scale across even countries with these different big picture ideas. You need to have some kind of a religion if you are really going to have a happy and healthy society, and you've got to do it right. You can't just take away the unhealthy ones. You have to replace it with something good and healthy. I remember when I was younger, I was going through some hard times in my life. My family life wasn't very good, and I leaned heavy on the church. Honestly, being able to go to worship services and sing with other people and have like a family there, and to be able to dedicate myself to something higher and express my emotions in public and to get love and support from that family, like that's important stuff. That's like why people go to church. You know, some people say that these churches and these people are like preying on the vulnerable and people who are emotionally unstable and taking advantage of them to bring them into their cult. But you know what? A lot of it is out of love, and a lot of those people's lives are better because they have that love and that support. So we need to have that kind of stuff in our society. Like a healthy society needs a healthy religion. So we will create new stories. That's part of it too. That's part of this integral project of refining over time. Because we have this project in mind, it makes sense that we're going to want to create new stories that try to optimize what we're trying to do. Like, okay, well, I understand this big picture project. Let me try to recreate the myth in a way that really optimizes our project. And I think that's a good impulse. That's a good idea. We can definitely do that. And we can make these stories that function on different levels of interpretation throughout the spiral, and one can lead into the next. And I think that's a really smart way of doing that. A lot of traditions are already kind of doing that, where you have like the more literal, simple interpretations and then the more deep and complex reads once you learn how to read it like that. So we can make stories that work on multiple levels. So figuring out how to be in touch with reality, figuring out how to integrate all the systems in a coherent way that's not superstitious, again, that's in touch with reality in a coherent and consistent way that doesn't favor one tradition. These are the problems with personal integration. But if you actually took on the project of trying to, with integrity, with intellectual honesty, in a way that you could actually justify it, create a system for the future where people were going to hold you accountable for the ways that you might potentially have personal bias. This is going to help you in your own development to really examine some of these things that you might have taken for granted and to really take a good hard look and to question some of these things, to try to wring personal bias out of your integration, to actually get to a skillful, holistic, and pure integration of religion and spirituality, minus your own personal issues. Now, if you go back to the previous video, I talk about how we can customize our own spiritual practice in a way where our spiritual practice can harmonize with the collective ideas about integral religion and still be customized for you personally in a way where you are using personal variations that you like from different traditions as a way to practice spirituality in different ways that relate to different universal functions. So yes, the individual and the collective integrations harmonize with each other. We can talk about a holistic or an integral life practice or an integral spiritual practice, the 4 S's of an integral spiritual practice, and how different traditions can emphasize and be experts in particular areas and have blind spots in other areas, and how it can be really good and important to perhaps look to this tradition for this practice or this tradition for that practice and avoid the pitfalls of this tradition and the pitfalls of that tradition. We also can know that there are universal ideas and cultural and personal variations. We also know that there are important spiritual tools that every seeker can get along the path, that there are stages of waking up, of growing up, of showing up and cleaning up. And we can talk about all of these things and include them without getting bogged down in one way of talking about that. This is why if you have 5 different ways of talking about things, you also have 5 different ways of understanding things. You're less likely to have some kind of reductionist, unexamined assumption about how things are. So we definitely want to avoid the conflation and the clusterfuck and have some healthy integration. So some of the problems I'm seeing here are maybe there's a bit of a premature development. Maybe you learned about integral a little bit too soon and you didn't really deconstruct some of your old traditions. You still have some pre-trans confusion and a lack of construct awareness, like maybe you don't really understand the relative nature of symbolism. Maybe you haven't really brought rationality and the sword online. Maybe you're not really that skeptical. You're kind of still bathing a little bit too much in the green woo and sort of found your way into an integral landscape and heard Ken Wilber tell you were integral and now you think you're integral too because you think that integral is the same as some of this new age stuff that you heard people talking about. Sounds kind of similar, so you probably think that you're already integral. These are the main problems that we still see in the integral space. And a lot of it has to do with a lack of construct awareness and an overglorification of personal experience, a demonization of science and rationality, and major pre-trans confusion, bad integration in terms of being able to have a fair approach to religious symbolism. And there aren't really a lot of great examples, except for maybe Joseph Campbell. At this next stage of development, think about religion not just as your own personal project, but what it would be like to have a fair approach to integration for future generations. Like, we have to tell future generations a story. We have to set up a system for them. We have to do it right. We have to engage the whole spiral and create a healthy version of religion to fulfill the important functions that religion plays. Functions in all 4 quadrants to help explain the path of what it is to live a life of integrity and to unite the individual to the grand narrative in a way where life becomes sacred and meaningful and fulfilling to them. This is important for all humanity. It's not Jesus or Buddha that's in the forest or in the desert being tempted. It's you and me. And what are we going to live for? This isn't stories about some people in the past. These are stories about us here and now, and how are we living? And this is the point of what a healthy religion is doing. There's a project of having a religion, religio, means linking back. The point of a religion is to connect the individual to this larger context, to this grand narrative. Humans are storytellers. The thing is, we have to tell young people who are coming into the world some kind of a story, some kind of a grand narrative. And we want to make it a sacred one that plugs them and their life and the importance of what they're doing into this grand narrative so that way they can have higher purpose and be fulfilled. There are certain important functions that religions fulfill, and that has to be done in a healthy way. It's a little bit more complicated now because we're creating a religion for the whole spiral. And part of this project is going to be trying to do that in a way that doesn't stop people's development, where you can grow up through stages and it's not like you're going to get stifled by fundamentalism at a particular level. There are going to be different levels of translations of a story anyways. That is inevitable. It seems to me that the two main things that we're trying to get out of in terms of problems of the past are the superstitious elements and the divisive elements. And a lot of this comes back down to symbol absolutism. So if we can get rid of this symbol absolutism and get rid of this I'm a Christian, I'm a Buddhist, and see past all that and start to actually take an integrative approach to religion, we'll be able to get the best out of all of these traditions, out of all of our human traditions. These traditions are our birthright, regardless of what culture you're born in or where you live or what color your skin is. We are all parts of this human family. All the world's traditions bring something valuable to the table, at least for us to be able to understand about ourselves and about our past. And it's all part of the human story, right? So this gets rid of the divisiveness aspect of it. Then if you can realize that it's not literal, that it's just poetry, that it's metaphors about the human condition, humans are storytellers, and we've been telling these stories about the mystery of reality all through history. And if we can include all of these stories, everything from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Bible to Greek mythology to Star Wars, all of it as mythology, as stories about what it is to be human and how to live the good life and how to connect to the grand narrative, then we can really have a healthy integrative tradition that's not divisive, that includes everyone, that's not superstitious and not getting hung up in a particular symbol that people are going to fight and kill each other over. And it deals with this larger problem of lack of meaning and purpose and no healthy tradition to go to for things like community and real helpful wisdom. So I think an integral religion of the future is going to be much more like a Joseph Campbell style approach to religion. Much more of a healthy integration than it is going to be a hack into Christianity or a hack into Buddhism. Now, there are people like Michael Dowd, for example, who I think is doing this project in a healthy way. He is an integralist who has a healthy version of integration, and he goes into his tradition that he came from, Christianity. Of course, we're going to favor particular traditions. That's just part of it. Everyone's going to know more about some traditions than others. But within that tradition, he deconstructs the tradition and says that it's just one way of talking about it. And this allows them to then be able to reach across to other different traditions and include them and value them and be open to their stories. So Michael Dowd's approach is as more of a hack, and hopefully his version of healthy translation can lead people to transformation into a more integral perspective.
And what we now know, and I say know rather than believe, is that ultimate creativity, God, the goddess, whatever your name for ultimate creativity, didn't merely make everything at the beginning of time the way a potter makes a pot or a carpenter makes a table. That divine creativity, God's creativity, exists throughout the entire universe in a nested sense. And from this vantage point, God is not a supreme landlord residing off the planet and outside the universe. A supreme engineer who made this clockwork universe. God is nothing less than a sacred, proper name for that ultimate creative reality, the largest creative reality that includes it all, yet transcends it all. Notice this is a God beyond belief or disbelief. This is a God that is undeniably real in every drop of experience. You may or may not choose to call ultimate reality God, but that reality is itself undeniable. See, we are a subset of the whole. We can't get outside the whole to examine it. So I have to use analogies and metaphors to describe the nature of ultimacy. What this means, of course, is that there's no one right way to talk about ultimate reality, which I realize is probably preaching to the choir here, but this may be news to many of your neighbors. Or when the Bible, for example, speaks of God forming us from the dust of the ground and breathing into us the breath of life, that's a true story.
It's a traditionally sacred way, what Joseph Campbell would call a mythic way, of talking about the fact that we grew out of the dynamics of the planet itself, and it's the divine creative reality of the whole or ultimate reality that makes that possible, the God that makes it possible. I mean, I don't know how Moses could have said it any other way, assuming he wrote that.
So for the record, I think both translation and transformation are important projects, but we translate down the spiral to help people to grow up. Ultimately, us as integralists, we should have a transformative, healthy, new, upgraded idea of religion based on a skillful and rigorous, intellectually honest synthesis. So that's a valuable project. I'm not trying to say that that's not a worthwhile project. What I'm trying to say is, if you think that you can be an integral Christian or be an integral Buddhist and that that's just good enough, I'm going to say that's not really that integral. That you still have a lot of work to do to be a good, healthy integralist. And I don't think Wilber is a good example. I think Wilber's integration is biased and unskillful, and he tends to reduce everything to the mountaintops that he prefers. Healthy integration looks for overarching patterns, underlying themes, and understands how they appear in different cultural costumes. Transrational poetry needs to cash out in accord with the truth. This is why I talk about the cup and the sword. The sword, the flaming sword of truth that cuts through the bullshit, as well as the cup of poetry. And again, these things are intertwined because facts and truth and all this stuff are using relative symbols to communicate. So in a sense, even the story of the Big Bang, though it may be true, is still spoken about as a poetic story, as a myth. But the myth cashes out in accord with truth. And then poetry, when it's doing its job, when it's good, when it's healthy, when it's actually pointing at something and it's of value, it's because it's pointing at something that's true, right? So the cup and the sword need to harmonize with each other. One thing I want to point out is, if you look at some of the communication by integralists, it's a whole new style of communication. This is where Wilber is really right. But it's all about how you do it. There's this new brilliant kind of combination of both the poetic storytelling stuff, as well as this kind of accurate, academic, accessible, and skillful kind of an approach, right? So even in our communications, you get a bit of this cup and the sword. You get the pointed truths being told, but also the poetic and beautiful package in which it comes to you. So in the future, what we're going to be working on through this integral language changing, integral values changing, because as the values change, the language will change with it. Nietzsche called this project the transvaluation of values. And this is why integralists talk about things like holons as opposed to individuals. Individuals has become cancerous, not only in a Western capitalistic kind of sense, but in an Eastern egoic concept of separateness kind of a sense. So more in line with science and this idea of fractals is this idea of holons. And so we stop talking about individuals and start talking about holons because it's more accurate and true. But we're also going to be doing more speaking in and with symbol sets, like using the matrix and those metaphors, and using Christianity and those metaphors. Talking about like being stuck in the matrix or being turned into a battery. Get behind me, devil, like you and your demons aren't gonna ruin my day today. There are valid ways to use this symbolism and it's powerful. And we can and should incorporate that stuff from a more poetic, transrational kind of view. We're also going to be creating new symbol sets and new versions, which is what things like the Matrix and Star Wars and these other things have become. New symbol sets from a more healthy, evolved, and mature perspective, making more nuanced and more relevant distinctions based on how we live our lives today. And there's micro examples of this stuff too, like, for example, even though it's not the most well-liked source, pretty recently PETA came out with this suggestion of new metaphors that don't emphasize violence to animals. Something like, let's not beat a dead horse anymore, let's not feed a fed horse. Or instead of killing two birds with one stone, we could feed two birds with one scone. And I think this is actually a kind of a cute example of some serious upgrades to language. I mean, if you're talking to your kid, would you rather feed a fed horse or would you rather beat a dead horse? These are kind of ugly metaphors that might be better left in a brutal and uncaring past. And also, let me say this, if some of y'all are really on an integral path and you're really living it out in your life, and you're practicing that depth and span integral utilitarian ethics, you're probably going to be wanting to move more towards a plant-based diet, because on this view, it's much better to kill a carrot than a pig, because a carrot doesn't have feelings. And so if you can live on plants, which you can, you should. Because it's better not to kill sapient beings if you don't have to. And I think this is apt in this context because we're talking about morals, we're talking about how the future might be. And so I think in an integral future, we need to move a lot closer to something like a sustainable plant-based diet that's more local anyways. I'm going to continue on. I think there's a good parallel between what I'm talking about and what someone like Sam Harris is talking about. Different possible peaks and valleys on the moral landscape. I think that's an apt metaphor for religion as a whole, being that there are better and worse ways to do religion, but also in terms of how we could approach religion. We could try a bunch of different things and see what works and integrate in the best stuff and refine over time. I think in general, that's a good way to go.
When I think about questions of right and wrong and good and evil in universal terms, I think in terms of a moral landscape where the peaks correspond to the heights of human happiness and the valleys correspond to the lowest depths of misery. When you ask the question, how can we move upwards on this landscape, both personally and collectively? Clearly there are right and wrong answers to that question, and these are answers because human well-being emerges out of our biology and out of our sociology and out of the way the universe is altogether. These are answers which in principle science can discover. What I'm hoping readers find in the moral landscape is a context in which to think about really the deepest questions in human life in universal terms.
Think about the importance of being able to support our claims in the year 2020, to be able to harmonize with science and rationality, and to not seem like a cult, and to not seem like some crazy, stupid superstition, to have a healthy and true integration, to not be divisive, to not be superstitious, to not be dogmatic, to avoid personal bias. You're probably going to be very careful, you're going to be skeptical, and you're probably going to end up being an agnostic because you can't prove the absolute truth of any of these traditions. If we do this right, we'll be connecting all people by connecting and unifying all our world stories. This is a recipe for world peace and personal growth and development, ending the conflict between science and religion, between rationality and spirituality, between head and heart. We're talking about creating a healthy system where we can have unstifled development for the whole spiral, where you can move up through stages in a natural and healthy way, where you're not going to get bogged down by dogmatism and superstition, where there can be different levels of depth that don't contradict each other, but lead into each other. We're talking about a religion that can allow for personal variation within the context of a larger, holistic, and integrative understanding of symbolism. So you have different personal approaches to the same universal functions. And this allows for variation without contradiction. So you can have your way of dealing with shadow work, and I can have my way of dealing with shadow work, and they can both be true, and we can hold that in a larger context of both understanding that there are different ways of getting at shadow work, and different traditions can do it in different contexts that might work for us differently. Of course, this applies on a cultural level as well. Different cultures and different places could have different variations on this same theme. You could have different churches or different sanghas or different locations, and different places could have different pastors or teachers or whatever, and they take different approaches and use different ceremonies and maybe have different methods. And it could be really a bunch of different combinations that all, again, allow for variety and diversity with discernment without contradiction. We can allow for that, we can learn from that, and it doesn't bring up a contradiction in our worldview. So we can have the best of all the traditions and get all the pros from all of these great traditions without over-glorifying any of them and without personal bias of integration. We can have a universal approach to religion and spirituality that unites all traditions and allows for this whole next level of an integrated, healthy version of humanity that really knows what it's doing. Finally, This is why I get passionate about these things. This is why I sometimes get very frustrated when our integral leaders don't seem to be doing it right, or don't seem to be leading us in a good direction, or seem to be leading us into a ditch. I hope you understand what I'm saying. So it's early days. At this point, I'm mostly just trying to get you to see the problems of the early and mid-stage approaches to integration and get you to think about what a healthy, holistic approach to integration might be and the pitfalls that we need to avoid to be able to achieve it. We're still figuring this out. We're still working out the details. There's all kinds of details to be worked out. And I'm also not talking about how we would transition into this kind of a worldview. That's for another talk altogether. But today, I just really wanted to get you thinking about a transpersonal, trans-rational, integral, holistic, skillful approach to integral religion and spirituality. Much love. I appreciate you. Thanks to everybody for watching on the Integral Stage. Big up to all my Patreons and the people in my Friends and Fans Facebook group. Link in the description. Make sure you like and share and subscribe and all the things. And go to my channel and like and subscribe there as well. Ring the bell, all of that. Peace.